Caroline and Richard's love story began like many others college sweethearts who built a life together over 15 years of marriage. She supported him through law school, taking extra shifts at the hospital where she worked as a nurse to help pay his tuition. When Richard finally became a partner at his prestigious law firm, their dreams seemed to be coming true. They bought a beautiful house in an upscale neighborhood, enjoyed exotic vacations, and were the envy of their social circle, but life had other plans. At 42, Caroline was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. At first, the symptoms were manageable, but within a year, she needed a cane to walk. Her once steady hands now trembled when she tried to hold a cup of coffee. The vibrant, energetic woman who had danced with Richard at charity galas was now struggling with basic daily tasks. For Richard, whose life revolved around appearances and achievements, Caroline's illness became an inconvenience rather than a challenge they would face together. His colleagues' wives were hosting dinner parties and accompanying their husbands to important events, while Caroline could barely make it through an evening without extreme fatigue. "What good are you to me now?" he asked one evening after they returned from a firm dinner where Caroline had excused herself early due to exhaustion. "I didn't sign up for this. I need a wife, not a patient." Caroline's heart shattered at his words. "Richard, this isn't something I chose either. I thought we were a team." He scoffed, straightening his expensive tie. "Teams need all players to contribute. You're just dragging me down now." As Caroline's condition worsened, Richard's patience thinned. He hired a part-time caregiver but remained cold and distant. Their home, once filled with laughter and love, became a sterile environment where Caroline felt more like an unwelcome guest than a beloved wife. Then came the day that would change everything, the day Richard decided he'd had enough. "I want a divorce," Richard announced one Sunday morning, his voice devoid of emotion as he placed the papers on the kitchen table. Caroline stared at the documents, her hands too shaky to pick them up. "Richard, please," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. "We can work through this. My new treatment might help." He laughed, a hollow sound that chilled her to the bone. "I've already waited too long. I've met someone else, someone who can be the partner I need." The revelation struck Caroline like a physical blow. "How long?" she managed to ask. 6 months, he admitted without a hint of remorse. "Melissa is young, healthy, and understands the demands of my position. She'll be moving in next month." "Next month? Where am I supposed to go?" Caroline asked, panic rising in her chest. Richard shrugged, adjusting his golf gloves. "Your sister lives in Seattle, doesn't she? Or there are facilities for people in your condition." "People in your condition." The words hung in the air, reducing 15 years of marriage to a medical diagnosis. "I've been more than generous in the settlement," he continued. "You'll get the vacation property in Maine and enough money to cover your medical expenses for the foreseeable future. My lawyers have drawn everything up." "Your lawyers? You discussed our divorce with your colleagues before talking to me?" Caroline couldn't believe what she was hearing. "It's just business, Caroline. Something you wouldn't understand anymore." He checked his watch. "I have a tea time in 30 minutes. We can discuss the details when I get back." As Richard walked out the door, Caroline sat frozen, the divorce papers blurring through her tears. This was the man who had promised to love her forever, now treating her illness like an inconvenient contract clause he could simply void. That afternoon, while Richard was still out golfing, Caroline called the one person she knew would help, her best friend Diane, who had been warning her about Richard's changing behavior for months. "That absolute monster," Diane fumed after hearing what had happened. "Pack a bag, Care. You're staying with me until we figure this out." "I can't impose on you," Caroline protested weakly. "It's not an imposition, it's what friends do," Diane said firmly. "Besides, my house is already equipped with the safety features you need. Remember? I had them installed when my mom was recovering from her hip surgery." By the time Richard returned home, Caroline had packed essential belongings and left a note on the counter. She couldn't bear to face him again that day, couldn't stand to see the relief in his eyes as she left their home. At Diane's house, Caroline finally allowed herself to break down completely. 15 years, she sobbed. 15 years, and he throws me away like I'm nothing. Diane held her friend's trembling hands. You are not nothing, Caroline. You're everything. He's not compassionate, resilient, and genuine. And we're going to get through this together. Over the next few weeks, Richard's true character revealed itself in increasingly callous ways. He expedited the divorce proceedings, threatening to contest Caroline's medical coverage if she didn't sign quickly. He had her belongings moved to a storage unit without consulting her about what she might need. And most painfully, he began appearing at social events with Melissa, a pharmaceutical sales representative 15 years his junior, who wore Caroline's favorite jewelry pieces that weren't included in the divorce settlement. The community largely sided with Richard. It was easier to believe his narrative that he had tried his best but couldn't handle the strain of Caroline's illness than to confront the uncomfortable truth that someone they respected could be so heartless. He's telling everyone I drove you away, Richard's former assistant Jessica whispered during a secret lunch meeting. That you became bitter and impossible to live with because of your diagnosis. Caroline nodded tiredly. And they believe him because it's convenient. Not everyone, Jessica insisted. Some of us see exactly who he is now. Indeed, while many of their so-called friends distanced themselves from Caroline, a small but fierce circle formed around her. Diane, Jessica, Dr. Hammond, who had been Caroline's mentor at the hospital, and surprisingly, Walter Jenkins, one of the senior partners at Richard's firm. Walter had sought Caroline out after hearing Richard's version of events. His own wife had battled cancer years earlier, and something about Richard's story didn't sit right with him. My Martha always said you were one of the kindest souls she'd met during her treatments, Walter told Caroline over coffee. She wouldn't have been fooled by Richard's charm, and neither am I. That conversation was the first time Caroline felt a glimmer of hope that she might emerge from this nightmare with her dignity intact. 3 months after Richard kicked her out, Caroline was still adjusting to her new reality. She had moved into a small, accessible apartment near Diane's house and was focusing on her treatment plan with renewed determination. Without Richard's constant criticism, she found herself less stressed, which her doctors noted might be helping manage her symptoms. Your latest tests show some improvement, Dr. Patel told her during a checkup. The new medication is working, and frankly, Caroline, I think removing yourself from a high-stress environment has made a significant difference. Caroline managed a small smile. Are you saying my ex-husband was literally making me sicker? Dr. Patel returned her smile. I'm saying that emotional well-being and physical health are deeply connected. And from what you've shared, that relationship was not contributing positively to your healing process. As her strength gradually improved, Caroline began volunteering at a support group for newly diagnosed MS patients. Her experience as a nurse, combined with her personal journey, made her an invaluable resource for those struggling to adapt to their diagnosis. You help us see that there's life after MS, one young mother told her tearfully after a session. When my husband left last month, I thought everything was over. But looking at you, you're rebuilding, you're helping others. It gives me hope. Caroline squeezed the woman's hand. We're stronger than we know until being strong is the only choice we have. Meanwhile, Richard's life was proceeding exactly as he'd planned. His divorce was finalized in record time, Melissa had redecorated their home to erase any trace of Caroline, and his career was thriving. From the outside, he appeared to have it all: success, a beautiful young partner, and freedom from the burden of a sick wife. What he didn't know was that his perfect new life was built on shifting sand. The first tremor came when Walter Jenkins called Richard into his office 6 months after the divorce. We need to discuss the Westmoreland account, Walter said, his tone uncharacteristically cold. Richard smiled confidently. I just secured their international expansion contract yesterday. The firm stands to make millions. Walter nodded slowly. Yes, an impressive achievement. However, certain ethical concerns have been brought to my attention. Richard's smile faltered. Ethical concerns? I followed protocol to the letter. Not about Westmoreland, Walter clarified. About the Davidson healthcare case from 3 years ago. The color drained from Richard's face. The Davidson case had been his first major win as partner in a lawsuit against a pharmaceutical company whose medication had allegedly caused severe side effects. Richard had secured a modest settlement for the clients while ensuring the firm received substantial fees. What about it? Richard asked cautiously. Walter slid a folder across the desk. Evidence suggests you buried test results that would have led to a much larger settlement for the patients. One of those patients has recently come forward. Richard swallowed hard. That's absurd. Who would make such accusations? Jessica Peters, your former assistant, Walter said. She kept copies of everything, Richard. Everything. The implications hit Richard like a freight train. If this information became public, he could face disbarment. His career, the very thing he'd sacrificed his marriage for, would be over. This must be some kind of mistake, Richard stammered. Or revenge. Jessica was always too attached to Caroline. Walter's eyes hardened. I don't think it's a mistake, Richard. And the firm can't afford to be associated with this kind of ethical breach. We'll need your resignation by the end of the week. As Richard left Walter's office, his mind raced. This couldn't be happening. He had built his life around his success, his reputation. Without that, what did he have? The second blow came that evening when he returned home to find Melissa packing her designer suitcases. What are you doing? He demanded. She barely glanced up. Leaving. I heard about your meeting with Walter. News travels fast in legal circles, Richard. It's a misunderstanding, he insisted. I'll fight it. Melissa laughed coldly. I didn't sign up for this. I wanted a successful partner, not someone facing an ethics investigation and potential criminal charges. Her words echoed his own to Caroline, a cruel symmetry he failed to recognize. You can't just leave, he said, desperation creeping into his voice. Watch me, she replied, zipping her last bag. Oh, and you should know I never loved you. You were convenient, a stepping stone. I've been seeing James Harrison from Hamilton and Pierce for weeks. He's just made senior partner. She smiled sweetly. No hard feelings, right? It's just business. As Melissa walked out, Richard stood in his immaculate, empty home, suddenly understanding what true abandonment felt like. The final devastation came 2 weeks later when the story broke in the legal press. Not just the Davidson case, but multiple instances where Richard had prioritized the firm's profits over client welfare. The article detailed how he had pressured clients to accept smaller settlements while hiding evidence that would have strengthened their cases, and there, providing a statement about the ethical obligations of legal professionals, was Caroline. As healthcare providers, we take an oath to do no harm, she was quoted saying. I believe legal professionals have a similar duty to their clients. When that trust is broken, the damage extends beyond individuals to our faith in the justice system itself. She didn't mention their marriage or his abandonment. She didn't need to. Her dignified response made Richard's actions seem all the more shameful by contrast. Within a month, Richard's world had completely unraveled. He was forced to resign from the firm, the Bar Association launched a formal investigation, and former clients began filing complaints. His assets were frozen pending the outcome of several lawsuits, and the house, his beautiful, perfect house, went on the market to cover mounting legal fees. With nowhere else to turn, Richard found himself driving to the small apartment building where he'd heard Caroline now lived. He sat in his car for an hour, rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain, perhaps even beg for her help. She still had connections in the medical community, maybe she could speak to some of the clients who were suing him. Finally, gathering his courage, he approached her door and knocked. When Caroline opened the door, Richard barely recognized her. Gone was the frail, defeated woman he had discarded. In her place stood someone with clear eyes and quiet strength. She still held a cane, but her posture was straight, her gaze unwavering. "Richard," she said, neither surprised or particularly moved by his appearance. "I wondered if you might show up eventually." "Caroline, he began, but found himself at a loss for words now that he faced her. She sighed. "You can come in for 10 minutes. I have a support group meeting to get to." Her apartment was small but warmly furnished, with adaptive features that allowed her independence despite her condition. Photos lined the walls. Caroline with Diane, with her support group, receiving an award from what appeared to be a patient advocacy organization. "You look well," he managed awkwardly. "I am well," she replied simply. "Better than I was when we were together, actually. My neurologist says stress was exacerbating my symptoms." Richard winced at the implicit accusation. "I've made mistakes, Caroline." She raised an eyebrow. "Is that what you call abandoning your wife when she needed you most?" "A mistake. I was selfish and cruel," he admitted, his voice breaking. "And now I'm paying for it. I've lost everything: my job, my reputation." Melissa left as soon as the trouble started. Caroline observed him calmly. "And you've come to me because I thought maybe you could help. Speak to some of the clients who are suing me. Explain that I'm not a bad person." A flash of something disappointment, perhaps, crossed Caroline's face. "So you're not here to apologize or make amends? You want me to rescue you?" Richard's silence was answer enough. Caroline shook her head slowly. "You know, when you first told me to leave, I thought my life was over. I couldn't imagine existing without you, without our home, without the future we'd planned. But then something unexpected happened. I discovered who I really am without you shadowing me." She gestured to a framed certificate on the wall. "I've started a foundation that helps MS patients navigate the legal and insurance challenges of their diagnosis. We've helped hundreds of people fight for the care they deserve. That award you see? It's for patient advocacy work I never would have done if you hadn't kicked me out." Richard stared at her, truly seeing her for perhaps the first time. "I don't understand. Why aren't you bitter? Why aren't you celebrating my downfall?" Caroline smiled gently. "Because holding on to hate would only continue giving you power over my life. I've chosen something better than revenge, Richard. I've chosen to create meaning from my pain." She glanced at her watch. "Your 10 minutes are up. I have people waiting for me, people who value what I can contribute, illness and all." "Please," Richard whispered, desperation clear in his voice. "I have nowhere else to go." Caroline regarded him thoughtfully. "There's a support group for disbarred attorneys that meets at the community center on Thursdays. They help with job placement, affordable housing, rebuilding your life. I can give you their information." "A support group? That's your suggestion?" Richard couldn't hide his incredulity. "Yes," she said firmly. "Because you need to learn what I had to learn, that when everything is stripped away, your true worth isn't in your job title or bank account. It's in how you rise from the ashes and what you choose to build next." She handed him a pamphlet from her desk. "I don't hate you, Richard. But I don't love you anymore either. What I do believe is that everyone deserves a chance at redemption, even you." As Richard took the pamphlet with trembling hands, he finally understood the magnitude of what he had thrown away: not just a wife, but a partner of uncommon compassion and wisdom. "I'm sorry," he said, the words wholly inadequate but sincere. "Truly sorry for everything." Caroline nodded, neither accepting nor rejecting his apology. "I hope you find your way, Richard. Now I need to find mine." She held the door open, a clear dismissal. As Richard stepped back into the hallway, he turned one last time. "Are you happy, Caroline?" She considered the question seriously. "I'm at peace. I'm purposeful. I'm surrounded by people who see my value beyond what I can do for them. So yes, despite everything, or perhaps because of it, I am happy." As Richard walked away, the weight of karma settled fully on his shoulders. He had discarded someone he viewed as useless, only to discover that her worth had never been determined by her ability to serve his needs. Meanwhile, his own perceived value, the success and status he had prioritized above all else, had proven ultimately hollow. 6 months later, Caroline stood at a podium, addressing a room full of healthcare providers and patient advocates at the annual Multiple Sclerosis Foundation Gala. Her foundation had just received a major grant to expand its services nationwide. "Illness changes us," she told the audience. "It takes away certainties we once took for granted. But it also reveals truths we might otherwise never have discovered about ourselves, about others, and about what truly matters in this life." In the back of the room, unnoticed, stood Richard. He had begun working as a paralegal at a non-profit that provided legal services to low-income families. The pay was a fraction of what he once earned, but for the first time in his career, he went home each day feeling like he had made a positive difference, that he hadn't come to reconnect with Caroline or seek forgiveness. He had simply read about the event in a local paper and wanted to witness her triumph from afar. Seeing her now confident, purposeful, surrounded by people who genuinely respected her, he felt a complex mixture of regret and pride. As Caroline concluded her speech to enthusiastic applause, Richard slipped out before she could spot him. Outside in the cool evening air, he reflected on how completely their roles had reversed. She had found purpose in her pain, while he was still struggling to rebuild from the ruins of his former life. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had abandoned her because he thought her illness made her a burden, only to discover that she possessed a strength of character he had never developed in himself. His success had been built on quicksand, while her true worth had always been unshakable, rooted in compassion and resilience. Caroline never knew Richard had attended the gala, but later that month, her foundation received an anonymous donation, not large, but clearly sacrificial, from someone of modest means. The accompanying note contained just 3 words: "You were right." She didn't need confirmation to know who it was from, or what those words meant. With a small smile, she filed the note away and returned to her work, not as Richard's discarded wife or as a victim of cruel abandonment, but as exactly who she was meant to be all along, a woman of extraordinary value, whose worth had never depended on anyone else's ability to recognize it.